Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
This is The Curious Collector, and I'm Stuart Holbrook, your host, back with you for episode 45. And glad to be here after a brief hiatus of a couple of weeks where I was doing a lot of international travel and working with collectors and collections across the globe. And sorry we missed out on a couple weeks there, but we're hopefully back on track, and I can bring you some more content and experiences through this podcast, which I just love doing. Thanks for being here with me today for what I think is a really important discussion to have. And, you know, it's one that I know a lot of collectors don't want to think about, and a lot of times families don't want to think about, but that is the eventuality of what happens to your collection. And, you know, I always joke that in the back of every collector's mind, they believe that they're the ones who will figure out how to hook up that U-Haul trailer and take it with them to heaven, collection intact. But I can tell you after 40 years, I haven't seen it yet. So what I try to do is in a delicate and fun way, though this is not necessarily a fun conversation to have, but nevertheless, in a positive, uplifting way, help collectors kind of prepare for that next stage and that next moment. And you've heard me talk about this before, that for collectors, what it really comes down to, and this was done in studies by psychologists over the years as to why 40% of, in this case, Americans in this particular study, 40% of them consider themselves collectors. And what was really behind all of this? Nostalgia for sure, but the real motivation really came down to something fascinating, and that is self-preservation. That is, after we are gone, that collection continues to tell our story. So as I have highlighted over numerous episodes in the past, the greatest fear of every collector is often what happens to their collection when they're gone. Interestingly enough, it is perhaps the one thing that collectors never seem to really prepare for correctly or entirely in a way that will maximize the ability for that collection to tell your story, to provide legacy, and to make it easy for your heirs. And so this is what this episode, The Reluctant Heir, is really all about. It's talking about you as collectors and what you can do now, though I know you all hate to think about it and hate to plan for this ultimate moment, but we're all walking down the same road, and we're walking each other down the same road. So I'm hoping that we can turn this into a positive discussion, and one that is a bit more uplifting in concept, and to know that with these tips and tools and cautionary tales and positive tales that I'll share with you over my 40 years of working in living rooms across the world with families and collectors, that you can have a beautiful, positive, continuing story even long after you're gone that will also resonate with your family, within your family, as having that internal legacy and respect for what you have built, that they will feel proud of what mom or dad or whoever the relative is, in this case, achieved in their collecting lifetime. Now, with that, I want to also say that I'm not an estate planner. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a tax attorney. I'm none of these things, but I am, I guess I'm a doll guy. So ultimately, I have worked for 40 years, as I've said, with families all across the world in very, very unique dynamics. Virtually every single one will have uniqueness to it in the way the heirs have approached this, the way the collector had left instructions or didn't, and the goals and the ultimate wants of that family or that collector in the sale of the collection. So I have a lot of experience in what I would call the front lines of this moment. And I've seen how collectors who prepared and did things one way succeeded in having a more positive and easy transition of their collection versus those who left no instructions, who really did believe that U-Haul to heaven was theirs and left nothing, where families may have had difficulties and issues along the way. So with that, I thought I would review and go over all of these different types of personalities and different types of collections and all the stimuli that goes into the decisions and into the complexities or non-complexities of each particular situation. Clearly, a state that has $5 and they're all pretty standard is going to be very different from one that has $5,000 and is in multi-million dollar category range. So we'll talk about that. But I think the important thing is to understand that that phone call we get, and let me tell you, I get these phone calls and these emails 5-10 times a day. Mom passed away, relative passed away. I have these dolls to sell. I have this collection I've been tasked with. What do I do? The personalities and the people can range quite a bit as to their conversation with me. You know, some will sound very prepared. Some have all the information laid out. They know exactly what they're doing. But a vast majority of them actually have no clue. And they are completely confused and don't even know where to start. And that's where I usually give them the advice, just pick a corner and start. But anyway, this is often part of my job, part of my work is handling people from that initial phone call and working it down the line to solutions. And I'm all about solutions and doing it in a respectful way and doing it in a way that allows them to feel part of that process, because I think that's important for a lot of families, is to feel a bit of a connection to this and an understanding of that collector and what they built. You know, often I am the steward, not Stuart, steward at the end of life for a lot of collectors in assuring that families do treat these pieces with respect. And I take that job very, very seriously. And so part of that is communicating with the collectors. So anyway, these phone calls come, as I said, with a lot of different personalities and a lot of different reactions. And with that, I thought I would go over a few of the different types of calls I get and what I've identified as different types of personality characteristics or scenario characteristics, if you will, that are directly related to either A, what the collector has done to prepare their family, or B, what the family has done to prepare for this as well. So I thought I would go through a number of these, or 6 of them actually, so that it will help you understand and see where this could potentially lead to very positive outcomes, or providing you with some cautionary tales of what I've experienced in the past in how it can actually work against your collection and create friction and problems. Before I get into these 6 scenario characteristics, I do want to kind of nip one thing in the bud right off the bat, because I know that a lot of collectors, and maybe not as much in today's generation of pragmatic collectors who seem to be very at peace with things that we have learned over the years from different generations past. That is essentially the false belief that your collection that you built will be carried on in some form by your family. Just in case you're still living in that world, I'm going to tell you it's likely not going to happen. And so they're not going to take your collection, move it over to their house, and continue on from there. I'm going to say I hate to throw out statistics that I don't actually have the data right in front of me, but just finger up in the air, going by memory over the last 40 years, I would say 2% of any collections are ever moved on to another generation within that family. So it's typically a very unusual thing. And furthermore, if you have multiple heirs, it's typically just not possible. So this is I hate to be negative and say pipe dream, but it kind of is. And the reality is, I think most collectors today know that. So I often think of that old cartoon, and I know a lot of you probably remember this and have seen it in different forms. It comes with different types of collectors. But the one I always loved is the farmer and collector who's standing above a field filled with antique tractors, hundreds and hundreds of them. And he has his arm around his son, and he looks to his son and he says, "One day, boy, this will all be yours." And the stricken look on the son's face in the cartoon truly tells an entire story right there of how most families feel regarding your collection. And they may respect and love that it makes you happy, but they don't want to deal with the collection later on and maintaining and caring for it. So that's the job, if you will. That's the passion of another collector. And that's why we say the greatest progression of any collection is to other like-minded collectors. And your family is probably not going to be that person. So I want to throw that out just to start with before we get into now these different profiles, these different scenarios that have come up over the years in that initial phone call I get from the family of, let's just hypothetically say, my mother passed away. I have this collection. What do I do? So the first one are what I like to call the well-prepared heirs. Now, this is the ideal situation. You have a scenario where the collector over the years was very communicative with the family as to A, what they have in their collection, B, what they want to see after they pass away with this collection and how it is sold, who handles it, where it goes, what may be kept with the family, what is not. They're realistic, they're pragmatic, and they've prepared. And they may have done so in a legal form, in a trust or a will, which we'll talk about later on. But really, it starts with the collector in that they have prepared the family. Now, that's not the only thing that has to happen. Clearly, there has to be some other parameters and other things within there. And I found that the well-prepared heirs tend to also have very strong estate leadership. And that strong estate leadership is typically established in an executor or a trustee being done, or a co-trustee in some cases, being presented by the collector ahead of time, not only for their collection, but their entire estate. So there's a strong and already accepted leadership in there as well within that family, assuming there are multiple heirs, which is not always the case, but assuming there are multiple heirs, that there is a certain sense of unity within that structure. That is, everybody seems to be on the same page. There's not a black sheep relative who determine they know best and they want things done differently, that everybody's on the same page. And with that strong leadership, they can move forward quickly and with clear thinking as to what will be the perfect next step for the collection. Lastly, within this well-prepared heir, they've grown up in the idea of recognizing and respecting mom or dad's or uncle or aunt's collection, and they understand the market, not the nuances. They're not going to sit there and identify every single piece and what its current market value is, but just knowing that they have value, understanding that French bébés are very popular, or French fashions that may have trousseaux. You want to keep those trousseaux together. Recognizing certain elements, not the details, but a basic understanding of the market that was gained through, let's call it osmosis, of being around their relative for the years of their collecting, listening to their stories and enjoying them, and respecting as well the pleasure and joy that that collector got out of it. So the well-prepared heir is the best. And these result typically in next progression steps for a collection in a wonderful manner. And I'll give you a few positive tales of when things go right in these particular moments. One of them, I go back to an auction that we did in 2024 that had a perfect established set of will trust that was established with a clear-cut leader, and the process of the auction and the whole element and feel of it was really wonderful and a coming together. And this was the Sandy Kralovitz family and Sandy Kralovitz collection, a name that many doll collectors over the years have come to know. She really did leave good instructions, not formal instructions in the classic sense. I think a lot of it was just more low tech in here's what I would like to have done down the road. And then they had clear cut leadership within the family. Now, there were many heirs in this particular estate, so a lot of different moving parts, but they were all cohesive in their thinking and there was a unity within them. As such, it resulted in, instead of friction, instead of questions, instead of any problems, it, from our perspective and from the doll collection perspective, resulted in a beautiful tribute that really did, I think, give extra legacy and extra positivity to the whole aspect of the auction event behind Sandy Kralovitz. That is, I think we had 15 family members who came to that auction, hundreds of people in the audience, and it became like a memorial, if you will. It became a really uplifting weekend in where we got to celebrate the life of Sandy Kralovitz and celebrate her collection all together, including with the family. And I use the Sandy Kralovitz family as a perfect template of how you do it right. And that is, you prepare, you have strong leadership, and you build unity within the family to respect and see the collection to its rightful next place. And that is typically to the next generation of collectors. Rosalie Weil was a great one as well. I mean, this could have been very complex. It could have had a lot of issues, but Rosalie left prior to her passing very clear instructions. Her family knew exactly what the task in front of them was. There was a strong leader again that carried that vision through from intention to execution. And the family didn't just sit on the sideline of events, but rallied around the auctions and rallied around the moment to bring together again a sense of memorial, a sense of respect. And it allowed family to see as well and enjoy the process of the love of collectors carrying on that tradition. And then, of course, another positive one that I recall too, that was maybe the greatest of all, was the Shirley Temple collection, because not just a well-known name within a collecting circle, here was an international well-known name from everywhere from Europe to Asia to South America, the child celebrity in history. So this could have come with a lot of drama as well, but it didn't, because Shirley had left instructions. The family was unified. They had a clear leader, and they knew what the best process was going forward. And as such, again, a great celebration. A family doesn't just allow the sale. A good family joins it. They are a part of the experience, and we love and embrace that. So that's three families, three very different types of collections, but every one of them turned into a sale that was actually a celebration, all because there was preparation, there was leadership, and there was unity. And this starts with the collector developing that ahead of time in their life while they're alive and preparing for it later on. Next on the list of profiles is what I like to call, I don't like to call it that because I don't wish it would never happen in any specific situation with an estate, but what I term as the contentious heirs. And that should be self-explanatory to all of you in understanding that estates can come with drama. And with contentious heirs, that drama can escalate rapidly. And why does this have to happen? And it's so sad to me. Now, I will say, I like to keep things positive, and I tend to be a positive guy. So I hate talking about these, and I don't want to turn this into a clickbait, here's everything that can go wrong kind of podcast and get everybody panicked. But, you know, it happens. It doesn't happen a lot, but you will get every year a couple of estates that end up becoming contentious. And I've kind of analyzed over the time what really led to this and could it have been prevented? And the first thing really to remember about that is that these situations, they're really never about the objects. Rarely. They're never about the dolls or whatever items your relative collected. They become a proxy for grief, for control, for every unresolved conversation that happened long before the collector passed away. And with that, this is where it's the most important for the collector to recognize within their family and their heirs that that potentiality could be there, that the dolls or the collection becomes a proxy for grief and a proxy for contention. And as such, preparation is paramount in these situations, setting up proper trust, setting up proper wills, identifying specifics about how the collection will be sold, where it will go, and parameters within the idea. If anybody wants to keep something, there has to be a set program of how it's established, all of these things, and having it done with a lawyer ahead of time so that it is really, really ironclad. Sure, everything can be disputed. It's not 100% fail-proof, but I have found that in every situation of contentious estates, it was almost always a result of there was just no plan and nobody knew what to do and everybody had different ideas of how to do it. And as such, this is really, really perhaps the most important and soul-searching moment for every collector to recognize within their family a proper structure. And it's obviously really easy. If you've got one heir and that's it, it's pretty simple. There's not going to be probably a lot of contention over one heir, other than them just going back and forth in their own mind deciding what to do. But if you've got 3, 4, 5, 10 different heirs all involved in an estate, there can be a lot of potential issues that you've got to address while you're alive ahead of time and establish it. I'll give you a couple cautionary tales of just how this can escalate out of control within family members that should be grieving together and sharing in the joy of your collection and the life you had as a collector. And I talk about these moments and a few of these examples of these cautionary tales, not with pleasure. It's heartbreaking. It's heart-wrenching for me to witness. And because in many cases, I knew the collector and knew the joy that they had over the years in assembling this vision of theirs. And I knew that they loved their family. And to watch what it resulted in was absolutely heartbreaking for me. So realize I'm telling these couple stories here, not so much, not at all, because I take pleasure in the storytelling aspect of them. I tell them just so that you can understand how things can potentially go wrong. So one example, in Texas a few years ago, I recall 2 daughters that lived on adjoining ranches, all part of a massive family estate that had been split in half. And the 2 daughters lived on these adjacent properties. And the mother passed away and left a doll collection, and a fairly significant one, few $100,000 in value. And one daughter was very specific in wanting it sold. And then the other daughter really wanting to keep a portion of the collection, which was rather surprising in this particular case. And that is the worst scenario you can ever get into, is one heir within a group believing that they want that collection. And I'll talk to you about how that could have been prevented in the preparation of the collector laying out a proper structure for the will or trust to be carried out. But this led to a battle. And the reality is there are easy solutions in this, but nobody ever seems to want an easy solution in these particular scenarios. As I've mentioned before, it is a proxy. And as such, there are other issues here, really, other disputes at play that we don't know about. But it ended up in back to forth battles that you cannot even imagine, to the point that in one meeting, I was sitting there and law enforcement had to be called to calm everybody down because it was getting super contentious. And it ended up with lawyers, it ended up with restraining orders, and it ended up being finally that the doll collection was sold, because unfortunately, you can't just say, oh, well, you can keep those and we'll just sell these. There are monetary aspects to this in an estate that are reality for everyone out there in a multiple heir scenario of a collection. So in the end, I remember, I'll never forget vividly how sad I was that 2 sisters had been basically torn apart over a collection that the mom had loved over the years and lovingly built. And I'm sure never imagined or thought this could ever occur, but it did, to the point that in that last moment of signing the contract before packing all of the dolls, I was driving back and forth between these 2 ranches, literally next door to each other, because there were restraining orders on the 2 sisters, and I had to go back to get all the signatures and make sure everybody was briefed properly on the steps going forward. So I hate to see this. This should have been a really joyful moment, not joyful in the passing of their mother, but joyful in the extension of their legacy and their life through these dolls, that the stories they could tell were positive with the collector's life. And they never really got to feel that. They never really got to understand how beautiful the moment can be if everybody is aligned and respects and understands this. Now, how could that have been prevented, this one particular scenario? If the mother had respected and talked to both daughters and identified that one wanted to keep a certain amount of the dolls for whatever reason, then lay out a plan, a system of where there is deductions made out of an appraisal, although in this particular case, the other sister did not respect any of the appraisals coming in on the dolls, saying that she had to pay that much, that it was unfair. And the other sister saying, well, they are, here's the appraisals on them. You want to keep them, you have to pay that amount. And so that was an issue. So what I say, the greatest thing you can ever do, and this is one of the advantages of auctions, is you can stipulate within the preparations for the collection that they are to be sold at auction. And if any family member wishes to have any pieces from the estate, that they are able to bid at that auction as a collector on their own, separate from the estate. They are billed. They pay for them, they receive them just as a collector, and then it is dealt with within the estate financials. And this is a very, very practical, pragmatic way to approach it. Unfortunately, if you have one person in that family who doesn't believe they should have to pay fair market value, it can be a problem. But if it's laid out in the contracts, in the structure of the will or trust, it ultimately really won't make any difference. They may be upset, they may not like it, but it is established and there's very little that can be argued. I mean, as I said before, everything can be argued, but you're pretty well protected at that point if there are clear parameters laid out for the structure of the sale and how to handle if anyone wants a certain doll. Which takes us to the next cautionary tale. And this one was, how do I say it? Wow. Really, really heartbreaking. I call it the 15-year collection. That is 15 years to sell the collection. Received a call around 2002 from two heirs in the Midwest who had a collection from, at this point, I believe it was the aunt. It's all vague now. I'm trying to forget this because it was such an awful experience altogether. But this was a true proxy war. The collection was maybe $50,000, $60,000. It was not even a significant value collection, but there was a massive fight between the two heirs over who had control of the collection and where it would go. Neither of them wanted it. They just wanted to control how it was distributed. And that was really fascinating to me. And I find that that is often the case within this. And it could be that one of the heirs maybe is friends with a local collector. And that collector, they want to be able to give them this collection to sell to help them. And the other collector is like, no, we want this to go to public auction so that there's actually a competitive bidding aspect on this to determine the proper value. So you could have two different conflicts going on within here as to how the collection would be sold. So it wasn't in this case that one wanted to keep them. There was a dispute over how they would be sold. But ultimately, as I said before, it really had nothing to do with that. It was just about control. And who would have control, no matter what it is, what it was. So this became a bit of a, again, contentious situation at first, and then it just absolutely exploded from there. In the beginning, it seemed like, okay, they have lawyers, the lawyers seem reasonable. It looked like we would find a solution to this in short time. So I set up an agreement with them that we would remove the collection so as to protect the items and to make sure they were properly preserved while they worked through the logistics of an agreement over a few months. So we did. We inventoried the collection, we packed it, and we brought it back to our facilities in Maryland where we put it into storage. Well, it wasn't 2 months. It wasn't 2 years. It wasn't 5 years. This battle went on for 15 years. One of the lawyers retired. I can't make this up. After 12 years of battling this out. And I would imagine hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees were generated out of this over a $50,000 collection. Showing again that it's not the money always, it is just simply a proxy war. And so this is something to keep in mind, that don't assume that there will just be a discussion over money. At some point, it could be in some estates just a simple battle over who controls what, who makes the decisions, and who sends things where. And so that ended up being 15 years that collection sat in storage in our facility waiting to be sold. After numerous appeals, judges, court battles, everything, finally it was agreed upon that they had to be sold. I'm not sure what could have prevented this. You could certainly take this scenario and you could talk to lawyers and they probably give you different takes on how this could have been avoidable in certain situations. And I'm sure it could have. But in this particular one, I don't know if there was anything that could have avoided disputes and problems with it. It was so deep, so rooted, so bitter that there may be a time that difficult decisions have to be made by a collector to identify just one trustee. In this particular case, it was two co-executors, and that's where it became an issue. And sometimes a painful decision has to be to make it one. So those are two tales that I tend to remember vividly over these years that are the extreme. And certainly they are not anywhere near what is the normal in dealing with estates. I mean, you will have some that will have little disputes here, little arguments there, but they tend to all get worked out over time, a short time even. And it tends to be that most are okay in the end. But you do have some, and this is an example, two examples, and there are a few more, where things really spiraled out of control, and things for a collector to keep in mind that don't just assume that everything will be hunky-dory after you're gone with how your collection is handled, that your preparations and assuming strong leadership within the family and unity and encouraging unity will really go a long way to seeing the legacy of your vision continued on in a really positive way. So that leads us to the third profile that I tend to experience in going back to talking about these phone calls that come into the office or these emails. And that is what I term the unprepared heirs. Now, you often see this with a very distant relative. Perhaps that collector had no real children necessarily, or anyone that was really close-knit family that can handle the collection. And so they've appointed a very distant relative. It could be a nephew or something along those lines, or a niece, to handle their estate. And that person may not have had a whole lot of understanding or experience with the collector and collection over the years because they were, distant. Some do. Some have a close relationship with that collector, so why they were named an heir. But sometimes it may be the only option that collector has is this one relative. And so they designate them, or in some cases, maybe the court designates them. And as such, they are tasked with a really daunting moment here of, I don't know anything about these. I have no clue what these are worth. I have no idea where I'm supposed to sell them. I don't know if I'm sitting on a $5 doll here or a $50,000 doll. I don't know if I have a $5,000 collection or a $5 million collection. And they are deer in the headlights typically. Now, there are two courses and two ways that unprepared heirs will tend to go. One is that they will just simply make poor decisions. They will just figure out, I don't know. I know she mentioned this local person, or just call the local guy or a local liquidator or whatever and say, can you just come get these? I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but I need to get them out of the house. And this is an important, I should have leave this for hot takes, but we'll make this as a hot take right now. That is that a lot of times in situations in estates, remember you have a collection and you have a collection within a home. Many times, not always, but many times that home and that property is the most valuable asset in the estate. And as such, the dolls are almost like a roadblock to getting to the point of selling the property or home. So sometimes people will just take, especially the unprepared heirs who didn't have a close relationship with the collector, did not understand the collection, will just take the quickest, low-tech approach to selling that collection, getting it out of the house within 48 hours and out of the way so they can sell the home and property, which is typically something everybody knows about and is more public information and easily attainable as to expectations. So that is something to be really cognizant of, in the sense that if you know that your heir will probably be a more distant relative, say a niece, and you don't have a whole lot of connection with them in the collecting aspect of your life, it is really important to have a moment to sit down with them and talk with them and lay out a plan, or do so in the filings of your estate papers, of your will or trust, so that you are giving them clear instructions on how they should consider going forward with the sale of a collection. It could be called this person. It could be called this auction house. It could be whatever you want. Lay it out ahead of time. Even if it's verbal, that's fine. If it's just one heir, not a problem. You can just tell them verbally, here's what I want you to do, and that will go a long way. But it is so often that they never do this. They never tell their heir what they should do in the sale of the collection, and they're left with this daunting task of deer in the headlights, as I've said. And I've sat in a lot of living rooms over the years dealing with this and talking to them. And some I haven't, because they just called a local estate person and said, here, can you just come quickly and take these and sell them? And it was a $300,000 collection, and ended up going for far less, and really becoming not just a monetary loss by the heirs, but becoming a lack of respect and dignity being shown to the collection in a legacy established, or a story being told as to that collector, which is so, I think, vitally important. And if the relative had known that, I'm sure would have done it differently. Fourth on our list of profiles of heirs and how they approach us is what I call the liquidator heirs. And these, I don't always get to talk to them, because they're very, very hard pressed to do something now, fast, and often not the type of people you would expect. Now, there's a relationship, obviously, to the unprepared heirs, but the liquidator heirs are different in the sense that they don't care. They don't care that they don't know anything. They don't care about doing anything related to learning about the items, or even accepting that they don't know anything about it. They just want the things out as fast as possible and as cleanly as possible. So interestingly enough, they're not who you think they are. It's not that they're lazy or that they just don't want to deal with this. It is often simply that they may already be significant wealth. And, I don't like to say that money should be the motivation behind this, but money is often the motivation behind doing the proper thing with an estate, because people, they naturally want to see proper value and proper market placement for a collection or anything that they're selling from a person's estate. And so the money part of it becomes a motivation. That's not a dirty thing. That's a positive thing. And as a result, liquidator heirs tend to be already wealthy. And so the dolls just seem like something that they just have to deal with, and they're really not concerned. They don't think it's going to generate any money. It certainly may not generate any money that's going to concern them. Their clear-cut purpose in this is get everything done as quickly as possible to go on with their own lives. Now, sometimes they will just go with the quick, low-hanging fruit, as I've called it, the local guy, quick, here, come get him. Can you get here tomorrow? Get him out of here. And sometimes they call us. And sometimes they'll call the local collector or a local regional dealer, whatever. And they want fast results right now. And I often recognize it right away when they call us, because they'll be talking to me and they'll say, I've got this collection. I want to get it out of the house. I need to get this done. What can you do to, and they will use this actual word, liquidate it. And I always stop for a moment and I take time to explain to them, we are not a liquidator. And this is not a liquidation, nor does any collector want to ever imagine their collection being, in that sense, in quotations, liquidated. And so I try to first help bring them around, bring them into a respect of the items. And so the money may not be the motivation here behind this. So what I have to do is really dig into the concept and the idea of what these mean to a collector's life, how they are an extension of their vision, an extension of who they are, and how they are self-preservation and telling their story to future generations of collectors. And if I can get into them emotionally through this, it will help the process a lot for realistic expectations of how you should proceed. Now, you can get there fast, you can do it quickly, but they have to kind of understand that this is not a liquidation. This is a proper conveyance of these items onto a new generation of collectors. And that takes care and it takes a little bit of time. Fifth is one of the most interesting, and that is what I like to call the dreamer heirs. Now, these are heirs who are typically prepared, typically very in tune with the collection, respected their mother or their father's collection of whatever it is, and really want to have a visionary approach to where this collection should go. And it often doesn't properly intersect with what I would call realities. And I have an example of this, and I think this will clearly lay out how dreamer heirs within a family can really curtail sometimes the process of this and throw everybody on their heels in having to deal with an estate that should have been easy and ended up becoming complicated. There was a museum in Europe some years ago that was well known, well established, and the museum owner, now this was a private museum, so it was not endowed, it was not in a foundation, and so the private museum owner unfortunately took very ill and was unable to continue the museum, and soon afterwards passed away. In that time, there were 4 siblings, all entrusted with the idea of what to do with this museum. 3 of them were pragmatic, rational, understanding the idea that the items should be sold from the museum in one form or another, and they would figure out what would be the best course. However, there was one brother, unfortunately, who did believe that, and I realize this comes from a good place. It comes from a good heart. It comes from somebody wanting to protect their mother's vision here in what they created. But this person believed, truly, really believed that there was going to be a single buyer that would purchase the entire museum intact and either continue to run it in situ there or move it to a new location of their choosing, and that it would be a super wealthy buyer who would pay a fortune to have this already intact, already created museum and would pay a premium for it. So they would have a win-win. They would get a premium price for the entire museum as is, and they would have their mother's vision carried on. Well, I got to tell you, never seen it done before. And I can tell you a lot of museum owners over the years who tried this, wanted this. I even know some who offered to give it away. Václav Sladký in Vienna was willing to work a deal with the city of Vienna to be able to continue on his museum there for a certain number of years with the simple idea that they would just pay to run the museum, that he wouldn't have to pay to run it. Not interested. Nobody wants a prepackaged museum, especially in a very niche category like this. And as such, you might find people that will want certain items from it or a collection, certain items from a collection, but nobody wants the entire thing, including other museums or other people who want to build a museum. First of all, a private museum owner who is building a museum wants to build it to their vision, just like a collector wants to build a collection to their vision. Just why an heir doesn't want their mother's collection typically, because what's fun in that? Part of the joy is building the collection. Part of the joy of building a museum is building your vision. And as such, it is impossible. Also, the very sheer reality that who out there has the money to purchase an entire museum, let alone pay a premium for it? So it just would not ever have happened. The 3 other siblings knew this, but this 4th one was determined, and he held it up, waiting, putting out information to try to find buyers out there for the entire museum, making contact with different people. This went on, I can't make this up, another 15-year collection for 15 years. In that time, the collection sat there, uncurated, no conservation work, the cobwebs forming, and at a certain point, one of the water pipes broke in this particular museum. It was in a 17th century building, and water pipe burst, and one little section, luckily not all the collection, but one small section of about $25 was damaged in some form or another, typically with the textiles, and value was lost in those items, in those particular pieces. And finally, after 15 years, this other brother came around and realized this dream was never going to happen, even though everybody had been telling him that right from the start. And so there we were. And we went there, and I remember opening the door with a skeleton key and moving away cobwebs and seeing signs that still had the entry price being in Deutschmark. And I can't make this up because it had literally sat there for 15 years untouched. And that was so sad to me. Now, the ending turned out great. It ended up becoming a fabulous event, beautiful auction, a true tribute to the collector in the museum that many people remembered and adored over the years. And it had a happy ending, but it didn't have to take so long. And it didn't have to be 15 years. And perhaps those $20 or $25 that were damaged from the water pipe burst would have survived and been part of that continuing legacy as well. So, Dreamer heirs, I get it. I know you're coming from a good place. You are thinking big from the perspective of protecting a total vision of your relative and seeing somebody carry that on, but it's just not there. It never happens. And it is just dragging on a process that could be much faster and much easier for you to also enjoy your life. Because I can tell you, every collector also, they don't expect this. They don't want this. They don't believe that that's necessarily going to be the case. Maybe old school collectors from years ago, but new generation of collectors, we've learned through these years the realities of this. They don't expect this. What they just want from you is to see them properly sold with dignity to people who will love them and carry them on. Lastly, is an heir that is probably not one that you expected me to talk about. But it is perhaps the most important one because this is where most collections end up landing, and that is they land to the spouse. In the particular case of dolls, it's often to the husband. And this one is unusual in our particular field, and collectors don't necessarily think about this necessarily from the doll perspective. But everyone just assumes that the husband will pass away first. But it doesn't always happen. Sometimes the wife, who in this case is the doll collector, passes away first and leaves the husband with the collection. And this is a very unique, sensitive, and one that has to be navigated with delicate care in the discussions with the husband about the dolls and what to do with them. Now, hopefully, not always happens, and actually rarely happens, but hopefully the collector has discussed with the husband in the case of dolls what to do should they go first, should something happen. And of anyone that you can leave a plan with, the husband is the most important. The reason why is very simple. A lot of times there is no motivation to sell the dolls because they're staying in the home. They're not selling the house after you pass away. They're going to stay there for most cases. And in that sense, they don't have a compelling reason to be able to move the dolls out and have them sold. But the second is it's both heartbreaking and touching at the same time. There's a lot of husbands who they may never have truly understood your collection, never really took part in building it, never really validated you for it. But after you pass, they suddenly look around at the dolls and they realize they are a vestige of you that is still there. And how could they remove them? How could they take them out? It's like removing a part of you from that home. And as such, they will sit on those dolls for years and years. And they can't take care of them. They do tend to deteriorate over time. And it's heartbreaking to watch in some cases because, again, like the Dreamer heirs, their heart is coming from a good place. and they want to do the right thing and they think this is the right thing. And so it's important to discuss with them beforehand the concept of giving them the relief that they need sometimes in understanding that if something happens, it's okay. Sell them. Just make sure you tell them all I want is that they are going to go to people who will love them and enjoy them as much as I. Now, not all husbands are like this, I can assure you. And I can't remember if I've told this story before. I often repeat myself, which is why these podcasts drag on for an over hour and everybody yells at me, can you shorten them up? But there was the one husband I remember who called me and said, my wife passed away, and I was shocked. I said, oh my gosh, I knew her well, wonderful woman. I'm so sad. I hadn't heard about this. When did this happen? And he said, oh, a few hours ago. I was silent for a moment, and I just assumed he was calling friends and people that she knew or talked about to let them know. And I said, well, thank you. I'm deeply honored that you took the time to call me to tell me about this. And my condolences. Is there anything I can do? Please let me know. And my condolences to your entire family. And he said, well, yeah, that's nice. But actually, I'm calling because I'd like to talk about selling the dolls, the doll collection. I was kind of like, sir, this is, I understand, difficult time right now. Obviously, this is not the time to talk about it, but we can do it down the road. Why don't we give this a few months, let things settle in, and I'll reach back around to you, say, in 3 months. And he said, no, I'm ready to do something right now. And I said, well, are you sure? And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, you seem to be pretty driven with motivation right now and seem to want to do something. So, I mean, if you're sure about this, I could be there Friday after 2:00. He said, yeah, after 2:00 will work well because the funeral's at 10. I can't make this up. And we were packing the collection on Saturday. So not every husband is going to be absolutely protective of your collection in some form that way. This one that was highly motivated. And as he said, I warned her. I said, if you go first, the first call I'm making is somebody to come take these dolls. I'm tired of living with them. So you can see from all of these different scenarios and profiles, and there's other sort of sub-niche types of heirs that have come into it. And sometimes you're dealing with attorneys who have been appointed sometimes, and they're very matter of fact, cut and dry, 1, 2, 3, 4. And sometimes you're dealing with courts. Sometimes you're dealing with nonprofit organizations. There are many different types of, let's put in quotation, heirs to a collection. And they all have different dynamics. But, I've given you some positive things, the Kralovitz family, the Rosalie Weil family, the Shirley Temple family, showing you the potential of how you can really lead this evolution of a collection to the next generation in a beautiful, positive way. And I've given you some dramatic ones, which are not the majority and occasionally will occur, but throwing them out there just so collectors do have an idea of what could go wrong. And then some of these other ones like the dreamer heirs and the husbands who, their hearts come from a good place. And I think most all of these, everybody wants the best for the collector, for their family member. They're trying to assure that things are done properly. And so don't just harp on the negative aspects that I highlighted. Use that as just a cautionary tale and realize that most everyone, their hearts come from a good place. They want the best for your collection, and help them to better be educated as to what the processes and steps are. Given all of this, and I keep mentioning how collectors can prepare their heirs and their family, what is it that you can do to prepare? And we've talked and touched on a few things, and obviously just having a plan. Basic. Have a plan, whether that plan is verbally conveyed to your family and told over Thanksgiving as to here's what I want you to do. I think this is an important time to come together and talk about this for the future so that you know what to do, or laying it out, establishing a trust, establishing a goodwill that will properly lay out the parameters of how you want them sold. These are all very important, but there's some other things that you can do as well. The first one is, and I've touched on this in a previous podcast, one that I hope that you've listened to, and if not, you'll go back and give it a listen because it ties right into the aspect of preparation, and that is documentation. And documentation is a gift to your heirs. Records, provenance, purchase prices, condition note, maker marks. These are a lifeline for the people that come after you. And so it will really help to establish a sense of what the collection is worth, what the importance of the pieces are, and build some realities into it. Because you could have two extremes with heirs. You could have the heirs that they look at the dolls and think they're worthless, and it's $1 million collection. And you can have heirs that look at a collection that's worth maybe 10,000 and think it must be worth $1 million. And so you're laying out the actual hard, concrete facts of it will help them start in the right place. Without the documentation, the heirs, they're really left guessing. And in many cases, even local appraisers they hire might be left guessing, because generalist appraisers in the antique market really don't have an understanding of all the nuances of dolls. And three-dimensional figurative art has more nuances perhaps than any other category out there, because it's not just the doll, the figure itself, but it's the textiles, it's the story, it's the presence, it's condition, and we know how to look for those things. So your laying out documentation is, let's call it the last act of stewardship over a collection that you've spent a lifetime building. And certainly they can call in a top doll expert that can help lay out an understanding of it, but you are always still left with, but I didn't hear that from my mom or my aunt. She never told us that. And that's why it's important that if you can document this in writing for them, it will be really, really helpful. The second preparation we've talked about already in the aspect of establishing a will, or even preferably in what seems to be the more modern approach to estate planning, is a revocable living trust. And trusts are the most popular, I think, established route for a lot of collectors, especially if you're sitting on a collection or a whole estate that could be significant. And you have to weigh this out really with an estate attorney as to what will be the best course for you. If it's a very small estate, maybe establishing a trust is not going to be worth the expense doing it now. Wills are going to be much more affordable in the beginning, but for larger estates, especially when you're dealing with a complex collection that might be a few $100,000 or a few $1 million, you are talking about a trust being a really good protection in trying to avoid contention and having parameters for clear-cut plans as how to sell that collection. Now, trusts come with a couple of really, really important advantages, I think, when it comes to collections specifically. First of all, I want to interject this. I'm not an estate attorney. I'm not an accountant. And as I always joke, I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So do not take this verbatim as the absolute gospel as to what you should do or why you should do it. You need to consult with an estate attorney. And it's a good thing to do for anyone who's sitting on a significant collection, multiple heirs, to be able to decide on a will or a trust. Now, trusts are really popular, more and more so every day. They cost a bit more money on the outset in order to establish them, but they come with advantages that, from a collecting perspective, are very unique. The first is trusts avoid probate. And I don't know if any of you have watched or witnessed or seen the drama around probate anymore these days, and not so much about what we talked about earlier in contention, but just time. I know in California, it is now taking, in some cases, 12 months. And in certain counties like Los Angeles County, they are having probates that are so backlogged, they're taking up to 3 years in order to clear. That's before the family can do anything with a collection. The house sits there, the collection sits there for 3 years. So you have issues where deterioration could begin to happen, both on the property and the collection, but as well, you are now being subjected to public record. That is, probate is public record. So people can go in and look for this and look to see, oh, look at this. There's a $2 million collection sitting on 427 Maple Avenue. It puts the collection at jeopardy. It puts the property at jeopardy. And so trusts have become far more popular in this, that it totally avoids probate. The other advantage as well is that if you become incapacitated, and, you know, it's really interesting to watch over the past 20 years a shift and change in how estates are coming up. Estates and the execution of trusts and the sale of a collection is only rarely now happening after a death. In fact, people are living so long, many well into their 90s and 100s, that they are reaching a point where other things may develop that leave them with an inability to care for themselves, let alone valuable collections or homes. And so this is where trust can come in to play, where the trustee is appointed with the task of managing your assets should you become incapacitated. And the primary approach to managing those assets is A, to protect them so they aren't deteriorating or lost, and B, to be able to utilize those funds if needed for expensive medical care or housing in a nursing home, anything along those lines. And so the trust allows this to happen seamlessly, that the trustee can then take control of the assets to protect them if you are incapacitated, and allows them to utilize some of these assets to help with medical care for you later on. So these are really important. Although I have to tell this story and throw it in there, that may not always go perfectly as planned. And I've told this story and wrote about it in my book, Never Ending Stories, the story of the great collector Berta Hackney in Texas, a woman who I adored for years and years, a true Texas spirit, let's call her. She had a fabulous collection spread out over 3 Victorian mansions in a small town in East Texas. And Berta was in her early 80s and suffered, unfortunately, a horrific stroke that left her incapacitated in intensive care, and doctors prognosing that she would never, ever go home. And they were unsure if she would ever actually come out of a coma that she was in at the time. But they said certainly there is no way that she will ever be able to go home and care for herself. Well, don't underestimate Berta. In the meantime, in the weeks that ensued, the trustee who was tasked with this care was left with the reality that pretty much half the town of this East Texas location had keys to Berta's house. And there is a multi-million-dollar doll collection sitting inside there that had no control. Are they supposed to hire 24-hour security? Are they supposed to change the locks? So what? It's East Texas, a small town. Anybody could still get in there. And so he realized, with the doctor's prognosis, with everything that's being told to him, he had a fiduciary responsibility. He needed to get that collection out. He had to protect it. So he contacted us. And as it was laid out specifically by Berta that he was to contact us, and he said, I need you to get the collection out. And I guess we're going to have to sell it. So we talked about it. He absolutely convinced me there was no chance she was ever coming home. We packed up the collection, got it back up here, 2 25-foot trucks and 5 days working in the house to get it all out. And a couple weeks later, the doctors decided to try an experimental therapy on Berta, a unique new medication. And by golly, she came out of the coma. And a week later, she went home. And no one had a heart to tell her. No one had the guts to tell her, I would say, that the dolls had been taken. And she walked in that house, and I can tell you from what I understand from the people who were there, she was fit to be tied. With the first thing she said, where the hell are my dolls? And so she called me, and what have you done? And I said, Berta, I'm following instructions by the trustee. So I just did what I was told. And she went on, and we talked for a while. And then she said, she said, maybe it's the right thing. Maybe after all, it's time. Maybe it was a sign. Let's just do it. Let's push forward. And so we did, and we sold the collection. She actually got to witness a beautiful auction and event in her legacy. So it ended well, but that's the one little crink, I guess, in a trust, is that the trustee may be told that there's no chance you're ever coming home and thinks they're doing the right thing, and lo and behold, there's a miracle. So just keep that in mind. But I think that's probably the only occasion that's ever occurred in my career. So I don't think it's going to be a normal thing that you'll encounter. So lastly, within this context of what can you do now? What can you do now to prepare your family? Well, there is what I like to call the elegant solution. And that is, if you sense even a little that there could be contention, or there could be a dreamer heir who's not going to be pragmatic about it, or a liquidator heir that's just going to dump them for whatever and not actually convey your legacy with these pieces. If you feel any potential problems, there's nothing wrong with the elegant solution. That is, you oversee the sale of your collection. And this is happening more and more these days. And a lot of it leads into what I mentioned earlier, and that is collectors are living so long that there is a certain point where collectors come with the realization that they're not caring for the collection as well as they used to, or they don't even really look at the dolls as much as they used to. They're not involved with buying. They're 94 years old. They're just in a maintenance point at this stage. And so they realize, why am I leaving this with my family? Why am I letting them have to deal with this or making them have to deal with this, as maybe it will be a burden for them? And so they're saying, I'm going to do this myself. And it actually can be, for many of them, most of them that I work with in this, a very rewarding and very positive experience in that they get to pick how they're sold. They get to determine certain parameters, as I mentioned, a word I keep using, around the way the collection is offered. They can choose colors of a catalog if they want, and they get to witness the protection going forward in the sense of seeing people buying them and knowing that great collectors have obtained them, maybe even museums. And that comes with such a sense of relief, such a sense of pride in what they accomplished. And so I think this is maybe the greatest preparation you can ever do for your family, is maybe just at a certain stage. And often you find it, and I mentioned this in podcasts, why collectors stop collecting. You find this moment when you realize you're 89, 90 years old, you're not really buying anything anymore, and you haven't bought anything in 2 years. Not that the age matters, because I have collectors who are nearly 100 and are still actively buying. But you just haven't been engaged in the market. You're not in doll clubs anymore. You're not going to doll clubs. You're not really reading the magazines. You just throw them in a pile. You don't really talk to other collectors. And the dolls are just kind of there. Well, that's the point to really ask yourself. Maybe you are the best person to do this after all, and you should take this step. And it can be a really wonderful, rewarding experience and a sense of relief, and could be a sense of relief for your family as well. And so I encourage you to really take some time to think this through on your own and decide if this may be the best course. And remember, the easiest thing to ever divide in an estate, cash in the bank. There was never any contention. You laid out who it goes to, how much, and nobody's going to argue, or there's no opportunity for it becoming a proxy towards anything else or any other issues. So that's the elegant solution, and one of the best ways you can prepare of all. And that will lead us into my favorite part of every podcast episode, and that is hot takes. This is supposed to be a very sensitive conversation, so I guess that was a little bit out there, but hot takes is supposed to be, well, just that, hot takes. These are little snippets of thoughts that don't really fit into anything else I was talking about, but are important to have in the context of the conversation. So I'm still waiting for Tammy to get me music, our producer here, or some kind of sound effect for hot takes to make it even more splashy. Perhaps we'll do that one day, but in the meantime, you just have my overreaching enthusiasm. Here we go. Hot take number one. Look, every collector wants to see a family keep a few dolls as a memory or an heirloom. They don't expect you to keep all of them. But, and I say this to the collectors, don't leave that choice or those decisions to your heirs to pick what they want necessarily. Why don't you help them ahead of time identify specifically pieces that may resonate with them and that they wish to care for as an heirloom? It could be a doll that you bought with your daughter when you were on a trip to Europe together, and you have great memories of that, and you want your daughter to keep that doll as a memory of that time. It could be something that was part of another family that you were close to, and that you became the protector of that piece, and you want that to continue in your own family. It could be something that your heir has a particular nostalgic relationship to. And here's the interesting thing. it is rarely, if ever, the really valuable things that your family ever wants. Now, there are exceptions, of course, especially when you get into contentious heirs, but that typically is a proxy, as I said, and not the item itself. So there's very few people that say, oh, I really want that $50,000 doll, and I want to spend the next 30 years of my life moving to 4 different homes and having to protect and care for that and worry that something's going to happen to it. No, they don't want that. That's left for collectors, typically. They're willing to take that responsibility and that care for the piece, and they're the best for it. What they generally want is something that reflects your collection, reflects your time, and that you can easily transport, take care of, and handle in moves and pass down to your children and children after that. So this is ultimately what you need to help them with. Sadly, too often, gosh, I have to say it happens almost every time, the heirs come to me and they say, we want to keep one doll. Can you help us pick one? Now, I can certainly find things that I feel would be emotionally connected to them because I'm generally getting to know the family and I often understand the collector and what they loved. And so I'll identify and pick out pieces of different value ranges and explain each of them to them and help them to choose one. And they often will choose the one that's the lowest value, but has a good representation of what their mother's collecting meant. But ultimately, why am I doing this? You can, as a collector, go through and talk to your heirs and say, look, I want to help identify. And this also alleviates future contention because they can specifically be laid out as part of the estate, as part of the trust or will, that these dolls, and there's no relationship to value, there's no money exchange, these dolls for emotional reasons go to this person. That is a really great practice to get into. Also, for the heirs who might be listening to this, assuming that maybe a collector parent has given you the opportunity to listen to this podcast to learn a little bit about preparations for way down the road, I hope. And that is for the heirs to avoid the cherry picking trap. While you can't always avoid it, because some collections, unfortunately, are going to be very, very top heavy on really, really entry-level dolls. And there may be no avoiding the aspect of cherry picking. But if you can, you've got to avoid cherry picking. That is somebody coming in and just buying 10 of the best things, or a collector friend coming in and saying, well, listen, I can't afford to buy everything, but I'd really love to buy these 3. That will just spiral out of control to the point that you will degrade the collection into a point where maybe all the best things are gone and you're going to have a hard time doing what you need to do. And that is finding somebody to give you a solution for the rest. And it really kind of tears apart at the dignity and legacy of the collector in that it's being spread out in this way that is not properly allowing the collection to be shown in its complete vision. And so that's something I avoid trying to do. 90% of the collections I handle, we do all of it unless it's really just not possible. But we do all of it in order to, A, provide solutions for that family to be able to do what they ultimately need to do, get the dolls out of the house. And number 2, be able to give a better, clearer overall vision of that collector and to be able to convey that to the new generation. Also, this is a really interesting one that comes up. So hot take number 3, I forgot the introduction, sorry. But some of the heirs avoiding the over-researching trap. This is really interesting. And a lot of people probably think, oh, well, most people must just pick up the phone and call you and that's it. And that is the case a lot of times. And a lot of families will do a little bit of research. They try to figure out exactly what's here. They may look at some notes, whatever, go online, look at a few things. But then there are some family members who decide to turn this into a 4-year process of researching every single piece in the collection, trying to denote every single value, every single attribution. And they're not collectors and have no knowledge whatsoever. They're going on basic things they're finding online. They're now even using AI. I get estate inquiries of collections from heirs that clearly the entire summary of the collection was written by AI because it's going on and on about the artistic, fabulous beauty of this wonderful Armand Marseille 390. And really, it's overdone, basically. And so heirs can overdo it sometimes, and they will spend months, years trying to document and research themselves. And interestingly enough, often they'll call us, I'll come into the meeting, I will sit down with them, and the conversation will go like this. Here you are, Stuart. I prepared for you over the past 6 months the entire documentation of this collection as I see it, all the information you'll need. And I look at them and I look at the notebook and I say, but I have the greatest documentation in the world because I know what I'm looking at. I'm seeing the dolls. That's all I want. I just want to be able to look at the dolls and look at the pieces, and I can assess them myself. And I know they're kind of hurt by this, and I try to explain it to them. And what I try to do is make them feel good, at least about what they did, in saying that, it was a process that you probably needed. You needed to come to an understanding of the collection yourself with the relationship of your mother is often the case. And so I totally get this and I respect it. But inside, I'm also thinking and wondering, did they really need to do this? Did they really want to do this? If they didn't have jobs and they were retired themselves, okay, maybe it was a fun exercise. But on the whole, it's really not necessary. As long as you have a basic knowledge of what's there and you call good, trustable people who understand the market and the nuances of the pieces, then you're fine. Just open the doors, lay them out. The only time documentation will help is for provenance, and that is something for the collector to be able to do, and why I said documenting your collection is so important. And for the collector out there listening to this too, when I talked about documentation and advantages, you avoid your family thinking that they have to spend 2 years documenting your collection themselves because you didn't do it. This way, you can present them this and say, here's all my notes, and here's everything you need to know, and they'll be good to go. Hot take number 4. Okay, I said you can overdo it with researching and trying to document the collection yourself. This is talking to the heirs, not the collector. The collector can never document too much. But for the heirs, the one thing you do want to do, take photos. That's the greatest documentation for you, the most useful one for you that you can do. First, in your initial outreach to different parties who you may want to talk to about selling the collection, this is your initial information that you can present to them so that the person can look at these photos and instantly say, yep, that's something we can handle, or nope, that doesn't fit within our category, too much for me, blah, 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 whatever. The photos tell every story that needs to be told if you're contacting the correct people. Also, they serve as a good guardrail later on for questions within the estate with other heirs. I don't remember seeing this doll was being sold, but I don't remember exactly what it looked like. Well, here, can you identify it in the photo? Yes, here it is. It was sold. So the photos can actually serve as a protection as well later on for you. That's the one documenting area that I would say is really important for heirs. Now, it may be that you already have photos from the collector, from your parent, who took them as part of their documentation. But if you don't have to take individual photos. It can simply be taking shelf photos. So one shelf, $10, there you are. Another photo, $10 on the shelf, there you are. These photos in any form can prove to be helpful. Hot take number 5. I mentioned this in documenting your collection, but please do remember that you're casually telling your future heirs the story of certain dolls that are vitally important will not be remembered. Now, some of them may be, but on the whole, I have often, and I mentioned this in the podcast Documenting Your Collection, dealt with family members who said, my mother told me one of these dolls belonged to, randomly just pick out a thing, Mary Todd Lincoln. And I'm like, oh, very interesting. Can you tell me which one? And a little bit behind what the provenance is, oral, written. And they look at me like, I don't remember which one it is. And this is very true, happening all the time. Collectors just think that their heirs will recall all of this stuff that they told them. So you've got to be really careful, and important things like that is documented, even if it means putting a little sticky note underneath the stand, something along those lines. It can be low tech, just remembering that they are not going to know that. And that is absolutely an important part of this whole process. In closing, remember what I have said over and over again in this podcast, but I'll say it differently this time, that a collection, an estate, dealing as an heir with a loved one's most prized and beloved belongings, the thing that fueled passion for them for their lifetime. This is not just a transaction. And it's not just your fiduciary responsibility. It is a deep and meaningful responsibility. We are all, myself included, in this moment, stewards to the story that they have, the legacy that they built, the lifetime of joy that they have had with these possessions that were much deeper than just things. They are an extension of who they are. They are self-preservation. So respect that always, no matter what. And I guarantee you, with that respect will come an easy path forward in doing the right thing, and one you can feel proud of as a reluctant heir. And I know, I often see it, the deer in the headlights, that overwhelming feeling, the house filled with objects, and thinking, how will you ever get through this? And I hear the family sometimes even say it. Why did my mother make me deal with this? Why do I have to deal with this? It's overwhelming. Where do we even start? And I always come in with a little bit of brightness and a little bit of humor to help lighten the moment. Because I understand, and I've seen many of these heirs feeling this in the past. And so I just look them in the eye and I say, we're going to find solutions. We're going to get there together. And I want you to remember, this is revenge on you for your teenage years.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Theriault. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.